Welcome, everyone, to our second Menachem Begin talk. And the subject of this talk should tell you everything you need to know about Menachem Begin, because when I finished speaking last week, I had people come and say, oh, you didn't speak about this about Menachem Begin, that about Menachem Begin. And it just shows you what a beloved person he was on so many people. He was by the end of his life, it doesn't mean throughout his life, but by the end of his life, he was really very, very beloved by many different parts of the Jewish people, many people who used to be his enemies and not appreciated him. Really, it's hard to find someone who doesn't love him. And so we're going to talk today about Menachem Begin, the statesman, the member of the parliament, not just the Che Guevara Menachem Begin, who's leading the rebellion against the British, but also the parliamentarian and who he was in terms of Israeli government. It's important to know that the difference between Menachem Begin and Ben-Gurion is not just a personal animosity, Ben-Gurion calling him Hitler, him calling Ben-Gurion Cain for his role in the Altalena. It was a fundamental difference, and it's a fundamental difference that it is important to understand. Why is it important to understand? Because it's a difference that resonates to this day in Israeli politics and just around the world. So it's really important to understand. So I'm just going to sort of clarify the difference between Ben-Gurionism and Beginism. So Ben-Gurionism sees Zionism and the return to the land of Israel as the normal state of the Jewish people. They see history taking a pause after the Romans expelled the Jews. Everything that happens in the middle sort of doesn't matter. It's all a blur, 2,000 years of history in exile. And our normal state, the normal state of the Jewish people is living as a sovereign people on our ancient homeland. And really, he's more of a believer in our Israeliness than our Jewishness. That is sort of the Ben-Gurion philosophy. So that actually colors a lot of things. So, for example, the Holocaust in Ben-Gurion's philosophy was not a major event the way it was in Begin's, because the Holocaust was an aberration, which is a product of exile. According to Ben-Gurion, the Holocaust is more of something that's a result of our abnormal life in exile. And really what we should be doing is living in the land of Israel. Everything takes a break when we're in exile and crazy things happen. That's something that Ben-Gurion believed in. Another thing that Ben-Gurion believed in is that basically we're an Israeli people. And Begin, on the other hand, believed in Jewishness. Begin often spoke of Jewishness. He always referred to himself as a Jew. When he was elected prime minister, he says he's going to lead in a Jewish way. And that's a very big difference. And that's something that's unique. Begin started, we're going to see, especially as prime minister, Begin started a new kind of Zionism. It's not religious Zionism. It's not secular Zionism. It's not Jabotinsky Zionism. Jabotinsky, by the way, was very secular in many ways. He believed in strength and controlling the whole, both sides of the Jordan. But Jabotinsky was not a very religious person. Begin was a new form of Zionism. And so we're going to see what that means. And it's a completely new kind of Zionism. It's interesting. Jabotinsky writes that and it's actually, Jabotinsky is much more similar to Ben-Gurion. Jabotinsky visited Kishinev, the site of the pogrom, right after the pogrom, and he sees the Torah scrolls that are on the floor spread out, and his eyes fall on two words from the Torah, Be'eretz Nochriya, in a foreign land. And to him, the same way to Ben-Gurion, the source of our tragedies was not living in our homeland. And so to him, a pogrom was not necessarily an assault on Jews as much as it was an assault on a people that are not living in their homeland. So Jabotinsky even spoke of himself. He saw his biggest realizations came when he was Italian, and he saw the movement of Italian nationalism. In many ways, Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky are on the same page in the sense that they believe that we just need to live in our homeland. Whereas Begin, when Begin sees a pogrom, when Begin sees the Holocaust, it's a completely different perspective. To him, it's because it's an attack on what it means to be Jewish. It's an attack on our religion, and it's an attack on everything that it is who we are as Jews. So Begin starts his term as a prime minister as a member of Knesset in 1948. He's actually not such a central figure, but during the controversy and the protests against the reparations from Germany, he becomes a major figure, and he really speaks very forcefully. Then he continues to be a member of the opposition, and Ben-Gurion skillfully works to marginalize him and make him a fascist, a fringe figure, call him all kinds of names. And this is what Ben-Gurion does. He goes on and he calls him all kinds of names and denigrates him. In 1956, famously, there's Operation Kadesh. What happens in Operation Kadesh is that the Israeli army Israel teams up with France and Britain and takes over the northern Sinai and the Suez Canal, and and basically it's against the United States. Begin joins the coalition to have stability. We're going to see there's 3 times that he joins the coalition in order to provide stability to Israel at time of war. And he joins for Operation Kadesh. But then when America tells Israel to withdraw, and Israel withdraws within 2-3 days, then Begin, as they say in Yiddish, he schreis Gewalt. He is outraged. And you'll see throughout his life, even when he's in Camp David, him speaking about Israel not needing to bend a knee to America, Israel not needing to sort of be submissive to the United States, and that's throughout his life. There's famous quotes of him saying, "I'm not a Jew with trembling knees," and all these quotes that sometimes people bring up, and that's because Begin really resented the idea that Israel should have to listen to what's dictated in Washington. He famously said, "The Jewish people have managed for 3,500 years without approval from Washington, and we're probably going to survive another 3,500 years without approval from Washington." So that's sort of Begin's outlook in a nutshell. So really, he did not like when Washington told Israel what to do, and this starts in 1956 with Operation Kadesh. Later on, as a parliamentarian, Begin continues, and he as a parliamentarian, he fights for civil rights for the Israeli Palestinians, Israeli Arabs who live under military rule. And despite the worst names that people call him, nonetheless, he is able to really advocate for Israeli Arabs. It's important to note, by the way, that with all the talk today about Israel's right and left, from Begin to Jabotinsky, they all, and obviously Ben-Gurion, they all really advocated for full rights for Israeli Arabs. Leading up to the Six-Day War, 1967, there's a crisis of morale. Has anyone, by the way, ever seen a picture or a video, or maybe in person, Levi Eshkol? Anyone see? Yeah? Oh, you did? In person? Anyhow, so Levi Eshkol is a very quiet guy, and he doesn't inspire much confidence. It's funny because, in my mind, he's one of the greatest heroes of Israel's history. Most people don't even know his name today. And the idea is that he was a man of action, and he didn't really speak well. He stuttered. He did not inspire confidence. So Israel is on its way to a war with Egypt, and they're getting threats of genocide daily. And there's this recognition that as good as Levi Eshkol is in making decisions, you need someone who's going to inspire confidence. Fun fact that I didn't know until this day, Ben-Gurion tries to oust Levi Eshkol and create a government with Menachem Begin, but Menachem Begin says no, and he joins Levi Eshkol in the government. So in 1967, he's again a member of the coalition, the unity government, and that gives him, again, more of a mainstream image. He's more of a respectable person that is not just someone that's being cursed out by Ben-Gurion. So he joins, and indeed, he's a member of the government, and Israel has a glorious victory in the Six-Day War. After the Six-Day War, what is the bedrock of the Beitar ideology, the Jabotinsky ideology? The grand and large Eretz Israel. And to Begin, that's a religious imperative, meaning to him, this is, and we'll see how this plays out in his compromise over the Sinai, to him, the land of Israel is sacred, and therefore he will not give up 1 foot of the land of Israel. So while many are talking after the 6-day war about what parts to give to Jordan, a Palestinian state, etc., he is having none of it because he believes in the Beitar. He has a 2-layer situation because he believes in the Beitar ideology of 2 sides of the river of the Jordan and large land of Israel. And also he's religious, which means that cities like Yerushalayim and Hebron and Shechem carry a very big weight to him. He famously said, he had these fiery speeches. He famously said, the city of Solomon, son of David, son of Yishai, will never be given to Hussein ibn Abdallah ibn Talal. Meaning, we will never give the city of Jerusalem to the Jordanian king. And he was very fierce about this. And after the 6-day war, obviously, this is a matter of national conversation. Then 1973, you have another event, and that is the Yom Kippur War. Now, the Yom Kippur War is going to shape Begin's being prime minister, and in many ways, it's going to shape the downfall of the Israeli establishment, the Labor Party, because there was so much anger at the establishment after the Yom Kippur War. From a military perspective, the Yom Kippur War is a victory because within a few days, Israel got its act together and really was able to fend off an army that is so much bigger than it. However, it was on the brink of losing, and Israel really had a flavor of what it tastes like to almost be completely decimated. It's interesting because in Egypt to this day, they have a march. It's called the October Victory March. And they lost the war. They lost 3 wars. They lost 4 wars because they also lost Kadesh. But they celebrate it as a victory. That's how the Middle East works. And, the Egyptian Prime Minister still gets phone calls congratulating him on the October victory. We have a question?
Yes, we do, from Asher on YouTube.
Yeah.
As an inclusive Jew quasi, how would Begin view the suggestion to amend the law of return to limit citizenship only those of at least one Jewish
First
parent?
of all, this is I don't know if my subjects for Shabbat were leaked, but this is the subject that I'll be speaking about, Seudah Shlishit on Shabbat. I'll get to that. But it's a good question. Yes. So now we come to the 6-day war, and he is the Yom Kippur War. So he's added onto Israel's unity government, but there's a huge amount of anger at Golda Meir and Dayan. To this day, we don't know who to blame. There's so much blame to go around. Golda Meir resigns. I'm sure some of you have your ideas of who we should point a finger at, but nonetheless, there's huge anger, and that's the anger that within 4 years leads to the downfall of the Labor Party and what they call the Mahapach, the everything being turned over. And this is when Begin is about to become prime minister. It's important to note that the way Begin became prime minister it's called the Alliance of the Oppressed, meaning there's a huge amount of rightfully angry Mizrahi Jews from Arab countries who have been treated terribly. And Begin really treats them nicely. His love for tradition and his traditional Judaism, though that can be secular, is very popular, and he gets along with them. He gets along with the religious people who feel oppressed. Everyone who feels like the elitist system of the sort of more socialist Israel, the kibbutzim, have mistreated them, finds a voice with Begin, and this is really how he becomes prime minister. So 2 factors. One is the loss of the Yom Kippur War, and 2 is the alliance of the oppressed, the people who feel that the system has not been treating them well. And that's sort of how he becomes prime minister, and he wins. Now, Begin's victory is a shock. You see the video of the Israeli TV broadcasters. It's a shock. It's after 29 years of the same party. Imagine if you had 29 years of the same party and suddenly a different party comes in. I already said the line my cousin said when he met Begin. He said, I think of you every single Shabbat Mevarchim of Rosh Chodesh. Why? Because we say, Hotzianu mi avdut lecherut. which literally means God took us out from slavery to freedom, but Avodah was the Labor Party and Cherut was Begin's party. So you took us out from Avodah to Cherut. And there's really a lot of people are ecstatic. Just let me give everyone an idea of how much what that day changed Israel forever. Begin goes the morning after he wins the elections. He goes to the Kotel to recite Tehillim. Since then, every single Israeli prime minister that gets elected goes to the Kotel the morning after they get elected. That has become a tradition. So in that sense, he really changes the way Israel runs, and that's why to understand Begin is to understand Israel today. A lot of things that were not said before, words like Be'ezrat Hashem, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, became part of the mainstream language and lingo in Israel, because really Menachem Begin, it brings this warm tradition with him. When Menachem Begin comes to visit the United States, he does something that I actually don't know, I don't think it's done so much anymore, correct me if I'm wrong, but he visits leading rabbis. I don't think the Israeli Prime Minister today does that. But Menachem Begin comes, he meets with the Lubavitcher Rebbe for more than an hour. They speak in Russian. It's one of the only conversations that 770 does not have a recording of. It was completely off the record. They spoke a lot about Soviet Jewry and the situation in Russia. And he goes and he visits Rabbi Soloveitchik in Yeshiva University and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein on the Lower East Side. And when he visits England, he goes to the synagogue to light Hanukkah candles. A lot of these things remained, not all of them. And in that sense, Begin, that's partially why he's so beloved by Jews around the world, because he's really an example of someone who led as a Jew. He was the Jewish prime minister, and that really meant a lot to him. And we're going to speak about what that meant to the law of return. It's important to note another thing. The alliance of the oppressed is not just of Sephardic Jews, religious Jews, members of the Irgun, members of the Israeli Etzel, Lehi, people who were not in the Haganah but fought the British, were not treated as state fighters. If you go to Mount Herzl, there's a lot of memorials for members of the Haganah. They're treated as veterans. You go, it's like, what do you call that in Washington, D.C., the cemetery? Arlington. So in Israel's equivalent of Arlington, you always had members of the Haganah, but not members of the Irgun and the Lehi. And he changed that when he came in. My great uncle, Yosef Lishansky, who was hung in 1917 by the British, he was a member of the Neely Underground, which was sort of against the establishment of Hashomer HaTzair. He wasn't buried in Mount Herzl until Begin came in. So when I say that Begin gives a voice to the oppressed, it's to much more than just one or two groups. There's a lot of people, especially the people of the Lehi, the Irgun, who suddenly find themselves getting the recognition that they felt they deserved all along. They weren't just terrorists. They weren't people who were militias. They were fighters for the freedom of Israel. So there's no reason to treat them differently than members of the Haganah. So in that sense, you really have to appreciate what it means to that Begin came in. I'll tell you another thing that will shock you. Where is Zev Jabotinsky buried? No idea. Zev Jabotinsky died in upstate New York. He came to speak in America and to do work for Beitar. He died. Ben Gurion prohibited his bones from being brought to Israel, famously saying, we need people, not bones. But he didn't let him to be brought back. It wasn't later till 1964 or something when Levi Eshkol allowed for that. But just imagine that. Jabotinsky, who's the head of one of the major branches of Zionism, was not allowed to be brought into Israel. Unlike Herzl, who was buried in Mount Herzl, he is not brought into Israel. So just, you need to understand how much was controlled, how much control there was before 1977, the Mahapach, the revolution almost, when Begin came into office. So that's just important to understand why so many people were ecstatic, and how Begin changed that sort of grip that the kibbutzim had. Now, what happens the day after Begin gets elected? Not so much happiness. Why? Begin was the hope of the settlers, the people who were building now settlements in the West Bank. He was their hope. So they thought, Now we have someone who's going to annex the West Bank, who's going to allow for Jewish settlements all over. And Menachem Begin then calls Moshe Dayan, whose reputation has been damaged by his handling of the Yom Kippur War, and he says, I want you to be the foreign minister. And this is when the folks of Gush Emunim start saying, oy vey, because they know it's not going to be the free-for-all that they thought it's going to be, and they realize that this is not going to be as simple as they thought. It's interesting, he also kept a lot of civil servants, so a lot of labor civil servants, even the ambassador in Washington. I don't know what is going to happen now with Israel's election, but when Begin is elected, he leaves the ambassador in Washington, the same one that was appointed by the more left-wing government. So in that sense, he behaves in a more sensible and governing broadly way, meaning he keeps a lot of civil servants in place who are not his cup of tea, and he keeps the ambassador, etc. And he invites Moshe Dayan, who's opposed to settlements, to be his foreign minister. And so in that sense, again, he's a disappointment to the Gush Emunim movement, and they say, wait, maybe he's not the dream come true that we thought he is. So there's a lot of joy, but there's also lack thereof. I'll give you the timeline here, and it's going to shock you. Begin is elected on June 20th. Note the date, June 20th, 1977. He goes to the July 4th celebration in the American embassy in Israel, and he tells someone, can you please call over the Romanian ambassador? Okay, they go, they look, they pass by the Romanian ambassador. Everyone's celebrating July 4th. I don't know if they had hot dogs or what they do when they have these parties in the embassy. But he calls him over and he tells him Romania has then a very deplorable dictator, Ceausescu, and he whispers to him, he says, you should know that I would not be opposed to visiting your country together with Sadat of Egypt. He whispers this to him, and indeed, a few days later, he goes to visit Ceausescu in Romania. Next person to visit is Sadat. And this is when Menachem Begin starts reaching out to Egypt and seeking its hand for peace, which is extraordinary if you think about it. We take it for granted. Israel's most deadly wars were with Egypt. Today, Egypt is not so much on our radar. The most deadly wars were with Egypt. 48, 67, 73. The worst wars Israel ever had were with Egypt. And so he reaches out to Sadat and he says, I want peace. There's a great story Israeli journalist tells. He's listening to the radio and he hears that Sadat suddenly announces in the Egyptian parliament that he wants to visit Jerusalem and speak in the Knesset. He calls Begin's house. Aliza answers. By the way, I should note, Aliza was his most beloved person in the world, his wife. And when he's elected, he famously says, one of the first things he says is a verse we say on Rosh Hashanah, Zacharti lach chesed ne'oraich ahavat klulotayich, lechtech acharai bamidbar. I remember for you the love of our youth, you going after me in the desert. And he really, she is the rock of Menachem Begin. So this journalist calls Menachem Begin's house. Aliza picks up and he says, can I please speak to your husband? She tells him he's in the shower. So only in Israel does this happen. The journalist tells Aliza, please tell him to get out of the shower. Okay. He gets out of the shower, and this journalist says to him, did you hear Sadat spoke in the Egyptian parliament and said that he wants to visit the Knesset? I don't know how exactly things went on minute to minute. I'm assuming he got fully dressed before he made the next announcement. But then he said he would welcome him in Jerusalem. And days later, Sadat arrives. Now, I'm sure some people here have been to Israel's old Ben Gurion airport. Anyone remember where you had to take a bus from the airplane to the terminal? Remember that terminal? The old terminal. Anyhow, when Sadat lands in Jerusalem, another fact that I didn't know, when he lands in Ben Gurion Airport, the roof of the terminal is lined with Israeli snipers. Why? Because Israelis did not trust. I mean, this is your arch enemy. Imagine if the Ayatollah of Iran said he wanted to visit Jerusalem. maybe you would say okay, but you would kind of make preparations in case it's not that. And definitely after the betrayal of the Yom Kippur War, where Egypt attacked us on our most sacred and vulnerable day, that, the Israelis were not exactly trusting of Egypt. So Sadat arrives as big news, but there's still, it's like with Yaakov Avinu. You prepare for all options, and there are Israeli snipers on the roof of the terminal. And if any Egyptians are listening to us online, my apologies, but it was meant in good faith. It was meant in case that something bad happens. And so they prepare, but indeed, actually, Sadat was there for peace. And they have all these negotiations. He comes to speak in the Knesset. He speaks. He's the first Arab leader to visit Yad Vashem, and then they start negotiations. It's fascinating because if you think of the peace agreement with Egypt, it is such a miracle, and there's so much to it that cannot be taken for granted. In the sense that here we are, so many years later, almost 50 years later, and it's still holding. It's still holding. And it's really a truly amazing thing. I'm going to compare a bit to the agreement with Jordan, but really it's a phenomenal thing. As they go on, I remind everyone, Begin is not fond of Germans, Kal vachomer Nazis, and Sadat has a history of being a Nazi. During the Holocaust, Sadat is a Nazi. So there's all these documents of how much he didn't trust Sadat, and how he gets into these difficult negotiations, but they agree before they even negotiate, there will be no more war, which is essentially all you need, really, because there was so much bloodshed. The negotiations hit a snag. If you look at the documents, there are many situations where the negotiations almost fell apart. And so eventually, the U.S. gets involved and invites them to Camp David. A lot of people, look, Jimmy Carter is an anti-Semite. Menachem Begin said that. But a lot of people think that the U.S. pressured Israel into the agreement. No, the U.S. stepped in only once the negotiations were falling apart. And so Jimmy Carter gets involved. They invite them to Camp David. There's a national security advisor of America called Brzezinski. Anyone know him? Brzezinski? Yes, I hope I'm... So he's Polish-American, which is great because Menachem Begin also has his Polish side to him. And there's a famous picture of them playing chess. And there's a story, Menachem Begin used drama a lot to win his side. He was very emotional, and we're going to see that had its upsides and its downsides. He was very emotional, and he was very good with drama. And so they sit down to play chess. You can see the picture online. And he tells Brzezinski, he says, I did not play chess since I've been sitting in the Soviet gulag under the Russians. He builds up a whole drama to show, his opposition to the Soviets, whatever. And they start playing, and Aliza walks in and she says, you guys are playing chess. How did you know Menachem loves playing chess so much? So it kind of killed the drama. But this is what he does. And he continues to negotiate. And Sadat starts demanding return of the Palestinian refugees from 48. He demands a Palestinian state in the West Bank. He demands there be a treaty of no nuclear weapons for Israel, and other really outlandish demands. And the negotiations almost fell apart many times. It's interesting. The declassified CIA documents say, who do you think the Egyptians trusted more, Begin or Moshe Dayan? Who do you think they trusted more? So it says they didn't trust Dayan. You know why? Because he was not religious. And it's so interesting that you look today at Israel's peace accords, it's called the Abraham Accords. And a lot of those good faith negotiations depend on religion. And so even though Sadat obviously was not a fan of Jews, he was a Nazi during the years of the Second World War, but he trusted Begin more because Begin was a religious person. And he said he doesn't trust Dayan because Dayan is not a religious person. So it just shows you how sometimes in the Middle East, there's some things that we don't really understand. They signed the agreement, and the agreement includes a withdrawal from Sinai. Now, how do you reconcile Menachem Begin being a man of Beitar, a man of believing in not only all of Israel, but also the other side of the Jordan belonging to Israel? with him being the one to give away the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. How do you reconcile that? So this is where Menachem Begin's religious side comes into effect. Two things. First of all, the Sinai Peninsula is not part of the biblical land of Israel. Remember, we sojourned through the Sinai desert. We got the Torah there, but it was not meant to be where we live. That was one side of things. Then obviously you have the bloodshed, the number of people that were killed in wars with Egypt. It was the biggest number of casualties. That's another consideration. And finally, Menachem Begin believed that if he gave away the Sinai, that would secure the West Bank and the Golan Heights as permanent parts of Israel. So in a way, he felt like he was sacrificing Sinai in favor of the parts that are the biblical land of Israel. Yes?
I have Eric on Zoom asking, did Begin have any opinion of Jesus based on Joseph Klausner's book, Reclamation of Jesus?
I hope whoever's asking this is not a missionary, because he was not fond of missionaries. But Menachem Begin, like most Jews, probably didn't give much thought to that topic because it's not on our roster. It's not a thing. Yeah.
Actually, he was asked this question.
Oh, really?
Yes, and it's a famous. It became a famous joke. Then he said, when he comes, when the Messiah comes, we will ask him. Let him come first, and we'll come ask him. Is it first time or is it just second? Is it the second time?
Look, he had a good sense of humor, but obviously it wasn't. I don't know. Maybe it came up with Jimmy Carter. What's the name of the denomination of Jimmy Carter? Episcopalian. So sometimes they were more anti-Semitic. Whatever it is, I don't know if the topic came up. Anyhow, Menachem Begin receives the Nobel Prize, and his speech is really a very Menachem Begin speech, where he is speaking about he doesn't just speak about himself. He says this is a prize given to all of the Jewish people. He speaks about the Holocaust, the suffering, and his family. Now, I want to speak about the unpopular side of Menachem Begin's prime minister time, because it was his economics, and it has two sides to it. First of all, just to understand what was going on in Israel before Menachem Begin came in economically, you were not allowed to trade foreign currency in Israel before he came, which meant if you have $1,000 in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, you cannot trade them in Israel. The shekel was not traded internationally. And so Menachem Begin is a capitalist, and unlike the more socialist Labor Party, this comes with the capitalist positions. So he puts in a huge amount of economic reforms. He starts having the shekel publicly traded. Foreign currencies are welcome. He cancels a lot of the subsidizations of basic foods, which were part of a socialist policy. And believe it or not, before Menachem Begin was prime minister, it sounds crazy, but it did happen. The policy of the Israeli government is they had this thing, they would make all the TVs black and white. Even if you had a color TV, all TV broadcasting was black and white. It was sort of an equalizer. The more socialist government didn't want some people to have a color TV and some people, it was all made black and white. And so he put a reform in that. He allowed for massive amounts of imports, and he still, though, believed in Jabotinsky's 5 mems. That were a sort of a social policy. The 5 mems are Mazon, Ma'on, Marpeh, Moreh, and Malbush, which means everyone is entitled for a roof over their head, food, healthcare, education, and clothing. So he did have a belief in basic social policies in the sense that no one should starve, not have education, not have healthcare. But at the same time, he was nowhere near the Labor parties making everyone's TVs black and white so that there are no differences. So in that sense, he changes Israel. He opens it to much more tourism, much more investment. The fact that you see Israelis going to the airport now on a daily basis, this is very much thanks for Begin. At the same time, we're not going to cut him slack. There was a huge amount of inflation because he canceled the subsidies on food. The prices skyrocketed, and Israel went into economic shock. It went from a very government-controlled economy to an economy that is a free market economy without enough buffers, and that caused major inflations and shock. At the same time, Menachem Begin says, look, you see all the Jews who came from Arab countries are living in slums, literally. They were living in terrible neighborhoods. They were living sometimes 13 children in a 1.5 bedroom apartment. And Menachem Begin says, we are going to put in the biggest social policy of my time, and that is building neighborhoods. And this is when you see in the late 70s and 80s, for those of you who've been following Israel neighborhoods, this is where you see all these neighborhoods start sprouting. Menachem Begin puts a huge amount of money into building housing so that people just are not living in refugee camps and in slums. Where's the money going to come from? This is a very Jewish approach that embarrassed everyone in the Labor Party. He says 50% our government is going to pay for. But the second 50, excuse the word, we're going to schnorr. And he goes around the world asking federations, asking wealthy Jews. This is where the very Jewish side of him, where he's turning to the Jews around the world and he says, I want you to fund it. In fact, there didn't used to be JCCs in Israel. There's something that I heard this from my friend Tzvika Klein. There were no JCCs in Israel. And now you go to every neighborhood in Israel, it has something called a matnas, which is basically a JCC, and they're all donated by certain diaspora communities. That's where you have sister cities and all these neighborhoods in Jerusalem that have plaques for a guy from Los Angeles or Ohio, because Menachem Begin says, we're going to build these houses and we'll get donations from around the world. Now, probably one of the most important parts of Menachem Begin is siding with the oppressed, and he didn't favor anyone when he sided with the oppressed. So when the chief rabbinate and religious parties started discriminating off the record against Jews called B'nai Menashe. B'nai Menashe are Jews who come from India. We'll see there's two groups of Jews that didn't previously come to Israel, B'nai Menashe and the Ethiopian Jews. And one of the first things Menachem Begin does, first of all, he sends a letter to Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef telling him to give a verdict on Ethiopian Jews from the Falasha tribe. And he says, I want you to see if they're truly Jewish. And when that happens, he sends the Mossad to start an operation to bring them in large numbers to Israel. And in that sense, it continues to this day, that aliyah. And then he notices that even though the B'nai Menashe are established to be halachically Jewish and eligible for the right of return, the chief rabbinate are doing an off-the-record thing where they require them to convert, or they only let them marry each other. Basically, they were legally Jewish, but they were treated as not Jewish. And this is when he got up in the Knesset and gave a fiery speech, because he always sided with those who were being mistreated. And he did that famously with the B'nai Menashe, and he gave no one a discount for that thing. Now we come to what's called the Begin Doctrine. Begin hears secretly that Iraq is building a nuclear facility. And the Begin Doctrine says, never ever will an enemy country that seeks Israel's destruction gain access to nuclear weapons. And he gets the pilots going. He gets a secret plan going. He only informs the United States once they're taking off, and they fly at very low altitude and mistreated. And he did that. He destroys it. It obviously followed later by the Israeli Prime Minister David Olmert, who hears the same about Syria. And he bombs either 2004, 2006. I don't know if anyone remembers that. But he starts the Begin Doctrine, which means no nuclear weapons for enemies of Israel. It's to be seen what happens with Iran if that doctrine was broken. But it's very much a doctrine that's inspired by his vivid memory of the Holocaust, where he said time and again, there will never be a Holocaust again, and that was his philosophy. And he put his money where where his mouth is, and he bombed Iraq's famously Ilan Ramon, who later became an astronaut and died when returning from space. But that was his doctrine, and they asked him, because there was always the tension between him and religious and non-religious. They asked him when the planes landed, do you give the credit to God or do you give the credit to the pilots? So he said, Be'ezrat Hashem, our pilots succeeded. So that really summarizes who he is. But that was his approach to security, and it got him into trouble. Where did it get him into trouble? Well, two things got him into trouble. Number one, we're speaking about Lebanon. The Palestinian terrorist organizations start situating themselves in Lebanon and shooting rockets at Israel. And so he says a Jew will never live under the threat of terrorism, and that's his belief. He makes two mistakes that are sometimes his strengths. Number one, his philosophy is that a Jew should never live under threat. And so he says, if they're shooting rockets, I'm going to send the IDF in, and we're going to, really take down all the terrorists in Lebanon. The second thing is he always delegated. He famously gave a speech in Warsaw in his Beitar days saying, here's my vision. How it's going to be done, I'll leave that up to the experts. And that's what his philosophy was. But unfortunately, when it came to Lebanon, this was his weakness. He let Ariel Sharon, he trusted him with the war, and Ariel Sharon, who was a big hero during the Yom Kippur War and did something very gutsy in the war, unfortunately dragged Begin against his knowledge deep into Lebanon, and that's where you have the, decades of Israeli involvement in Lebanon, and what happens is the activists of Shalom Achshav, Peace Now, stand outside Begin's house with signs of how many soldiers have been killed, and supposedly this is one of the things that led to his retirement. It crushed his spirit, the idea that young Jews are being killed because of him. And so when he wins a second term, he stays there for 4 or 5 months, and then he retires. Some say this is one of the biggest controversies. Some say it's because of the death of his wife Aliza. Others say it's because he had clinical depression. Others say it's because of the activists who held signs of how many soldiers have been killed in Lebanon. Either way, this is his last chapter, which really ends up, with the famous killing where the Christians killed Muslims in Lebanon, and Israel gets blamed, where he famously said, Goyim kill Goyim, and they blame Jews. And this is really what leads to his end. But it's fair to say that to this day, the legacy of Menachem Begin is one of consensus. It's hard to find a Jew from far right to far left who don't really, really respect him. His Jewish Zionism, so to speak, has become the predominant Zionism in Israel. It's a Zionism that is based on Jewish sentiment, on belief in Jewish history. It doesn't see being Israeli and diaspora as a conflict. He didn't see diaspora Jews as very, very different than Jews in Israel. And also his belief was that, to be Jewish was to be proud. It was to remember our tradition. It was to never forgive and never forget the Holocaust. And it was one that said we have to make sure it never happens again and to secure the future of the Jews. I know there's questions, whether it's here or online. Do we have any questions, comments? The law of return. I will speak on Shabbat about the law of return. So
I do have a long comment from Eric. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. All right. Is it a question or first of all, does anyone here have a question? Yeah. Anyone here with a question? No? All right. Okay. I think last time people wanted to know what the implications of Menachem Begin are to Israel's current government, which many people are concerned about because of its far right nature. But look, with Menachem Begin, the way he disproved concerns of his opponents was in action. And so that's what he did. He appointed Moshe Dayan. He really brought the people together. So I think I can't make any decisions for anyone who's in the Israeli government now. So time will tell if this will be a government of consensus or not. This is impossible to decide, but it's fair to say that his legacy is with us today. All right. Thank you to everyone who came. Thank you to everyone who listened. Thank you.